So today, we are up to part 8 in our story of Disney legend, Mary Blair, the person who many believed was Walt's favorite artist. As we left off last time, we were in Latin America about to finish up the Disney CIAA Goodwill trip. The Blair party, which included Lee and Mary, also Herb Ryman and Jack Miller, had moved through Peru and Bolivia and were spending a few final days in Mexico before they headed home to California, where large changes were about to come down around all of them. But before we jump into today's episode, I want to touch down on one more thing. I know many people listen to these episodes long after they are posted. So this past week was the third week of January 2025, the week of the presidential inauguration, and something on the news caught my attention as it relates to our story here. Specifically, the place that the incoming president stays before the inauguration ceremony. To be clear, I have absolutely no interest in bringing in politics to our podcast, but this residence is where both Republican and Democratic president-elects stay and have stayed for decades in preparation for the big ceremony. Here's a clip from the CBS News coverage.
It is tradition for the incoming president to stay at the historic Blair House ahead of their inauguration, and that's where Donald Trump is this morning.
And so in this, we have a small link in contemporary events back to the world of our story. This is the Blair House that was built by Lee Blair's family. Beyond this house, his ancestors worked with presidents and also were on the Supreme Court. The success of the early Blairs is part of the reason that Lee feels pressure to focus on public attention for his work as a way of proving himself in terms of being a cultural success. And I thought it was interesting that on pretty much every national network and cable news outlet this week, this issue was brought up in a small way, with a focus on the Blair House, which is right across the way from the White House. And so with that, we now jump into our story about Mary Blair as her life and the lives of those around her are about to change. For the Blair party, the final leg of the Latin American trip was spent in and around Mexico City. After arriving on October 19th, the group went to a bullfight. They observed men on horseback performing rope tricks. The following day, they visited the floating gardens at Xochimilco, where Mary brushed out a watercolor of boats moving down the spring-water canals, past flowering plants arranged on artificial islands. Her watercolor featured 9 flat-bottom boats moving along a canal, each filled with tourists and pushed forward by a boatman using a long wooden pole. Her painting was another expression of color, blues against blues, greens against greens, with whites and reds used sparingly to draw the eye toward key figures in the scene. On October 22nd, the Blair party settled their hotel bill, took a taxi to the airport, and finally flew home to Burbank, with watercolors and sketchbooks packed into their luggage. The strike was now over, though sour feelings remained, extending the social division between lower-paid artists and those on the upper end. Various Disney artists reported that unionists and loyalists mostly kept to themselves during these months, working in different rooms, passing each other in the hallways, often without talking. Mary and Lee, once again, fell in with the loyalists. Beyond the post-strike resentments, the Blairs saw another change around the studio. By October, Lockheed Aircraft, along with its subsidiary, Vega Aircraft, were ramping up production of planes as part of the government's contingency plans for the war. Not only was the social fabric of the studio different, but the overall feel of Burbank now had changed as well. The second and third floors of the animation building remained the place where many loyalists worked, largely in the story, background layout, and animation departments. After Norm Ferguson set up a South American production office on the third floor, Disney artists were able to view the art produced in Latin America. For the most part, longtime animators were familiar with the personal style of Disney concept artists, such as Herb Ryman and Lee Blair. But now these animators focused on Mary's work, specifically how the trip had produced a noticeable change in her overall aesthetic, a change that had a compelling visual power. Character designer and story artist Joe Grant believed that the recent set of Mary Blair watercolors not only elevated her standing at the studio, but convinced Walt that at least some modern art elements could be useful in communicating mood in animated films. Well, at first, Walt was a little stunned at Mary's new stuff, Grant explained, and then he began realizing it was contemporary and it was something he should be using. I think he discovered himself at the same time, his artistic self. Lead animator Ollie Johnston said, "After seeing the stuff Mary did for the South America thing, Walt couldn't help but respond to the color and the design. It was so different and so charming, he must have thought to himself, this is something no one else can get. We ought to see how we can use her." But it was lead animator Mark Davis who, in retrospect, could not only see how Mary's current success created new opportunities for her at the studio, but would almost surely lead to problems at home. In short, the Latin American trip both elevated Mary's standing at the studio, while by extension decreased that of her husband. Lee was at the Disney studio before Mary and did well, Mark Davis surmised, and was very well accepted, especially by Walt, doing story drawings and so on. But when Mary came, she became terribly important to Walt, and Lee less so. In terms of the Latin American material, the initial plan was to break the proposed set of 12 CIAA-supported cartoons into 3 groups, which would then move through production in sets of 4. For the last week of October and for most of November, Mary, along with Jack Miller, developed material for the 7-minute short in which Donald visits Lake Titicaca, as they had both visited the region. The lake setting was ideal as it was on the border between Peru and Bolivia. So long as the narration didn't mention a specific country, residents of both might assume the action took place in their country. As Norm Ferguson recalled, Mary and Jack Miller worked on duck and llama sketches, with the thought that the duck might be used as an archaeologist in a Bolivian or Peruvian setting. The story itself rests with the possibility of gags we could get around the duck and the llama. The duck would eventually be cast as an obnoxious tourist, not an archaeologist, half-heartedly interested in understanding local culture in the area around what in the cartoon was called the Land of the Incas, which again could be applied to both Peru and Bolivia. Work on this cartoon allowed Mary to continue to use her strong sense of Latin America-inspired colors to deepen the cultural presentation on screen. From what I have seen, Ferguson added, Mary has some interesting watercolor atmosphere sketches that look like possibilities for background handling. Beyond Mary and Jack Miller, the third member of the Blair Party, Herb Ryman, worked on a South American cartoon about a donkey who could fly, eventually called The Flying Gauchito, which would also incorporate some of the stylistic flair of South America into animation, with the story set on the Pampas grasslands around Brazil and Argentina, again slightly blurring the national origin of the story. The Flying Gauchito was intended as the first in a series of cartoons about gauchos. The belief that gaucho stories presented positive and memorable tales about South America was so strong that Jack Kinney, who then was directing Goofy cartoons, began work on a second gaucho project, parallel to the one overseen by Ryman, in which Goofy became an Argentine cowboy. Lee, on the other hand, as the last member of the Blair Party, was given an assignment on a far more traditional project. He outlined a new sequence for the proposed update to Fantasia that at this time Walt still hoped to release. Specifically, he developed visual and story concepts that might be combined with Rhapsody in Blue by George Gershwin. To many around the Blairs, the suggestion of artistic importance based on their current assignments were clear. Mary was working on projects with more inventive styles that might shape the future of the Disney studio, while Lee worked on traditional assignments more tied to the studio's recent past. This repositioning of the Blairs' professional work almost surely would have developed into a palpable problem at home, especially for the person who often presented himself as one of the few Americans to ever win an Olympic gold medal for his art, except for one thing: the attack on Pearl Harbor, which heralded America's entry into the war. Though in various interviews and letters, Mary and Lee rarely discussed the early days of the war, the attack on Pearl Harbor remains a key event in the evolution of the Disney studio. On Friday, December 5th, Lee was still working on material for a proposed Fantasia segment, and Mary on material for the Lake Titicaca cartoon. But then, on the morning of Sunday, December 7th, the Japanese sent 6 aircraft carriers, 2 battleships, and 400 planes to the waters near Hawaii, poised to attack the Navy base at Pearl Harbor, even though America was technically a neutral country. The surprise attack decimated the naval installation, sinking or badly damaging 8 battleships. Roughly 9 hours later, the Japanese attacked a U.S. airfield in the Philippines. Most of the Disney staff, including Walt, learned about the attack on the radio. Late on that Sunday, a studio manager called Walt to explain that Army officers were at studio gates, insisting that they use the lot, including some of its buildings and open areas, as a place to store equipment and vehicles intended to protect the nearby Lockheed Martin plant, which produced planes. Walt, the studio manager explained, the Army's moving in on us. They came up and said they wanted to move in. Walt asked if he could speak to a superior. The officer briefly talked to Walt, then added, but we're still moving in anyway. The underlying rationale was a protection of military assets, especially as it was assumed that since the Japanese had attacked both Hawaii and the Philippines by launching warplanes from battleships, they could easily continue their line of attack west across the Pacific, narrowing in on the American mainland, with an attack focused likely on Los Angeles or San Francisco. That night, the airspace above Los Angeles was mostly empty, as all planes had been grounded, in anticipation of an air attack. Spotlights sliced through the sky, searching for any plane that had not yet returned to an airport, and stayed on them until their identity had been confirmed. The few identified planes were largely passenger airlines who had not yet reached their destination. On Monday, Walt and others arrived at the studio to find the military moving equipment in through the gates. They asked Walt to remove production equipment from the large open soundstage. Around the lot, they positioned anti-aircraft guns in anticipation of a Japanese air raid. They stored millions of rounds of ammunition in sheds and covered parking areas. Beyond this, they began to move military personnel, then housed in tents at Griffith Park, into various studio offices. Well, I had to double up my artists in rooms so that an officer could have a place to sleep, Walt said. They had their sleeping bags down on the floors and everything, and they set up their own mess kitchen. Lastly, the military explained they would set up security at each gate, carefully monitoring who entered and left. On that same Monday, as the Army was moving in, Walt received another call from the U.S. military, this time from Navy officers who wished the studio to create training films for new recruits. They believed that films with basic animated sections would be the quickest way to train thousands of new enlisted and drafted men for service. In terms of company planning, this was part of the contingency structure that Walt had hoped to arrange for months. alternate revenue streams that would partially make up for the money lost at the box office. The first Navy order was for 20 short films with a payment to Disney of $90,000. "We need the films right away," the Navy told him. "We want the first film in 90 days. "Yes, sir," Walt responded. With this, the Disney studio was on its way to becoming a war-related industry, a unique designation for a company that until now had primarily produced family entertainment. They would continue to produce cartoons for a general audience. They would finish the animated feature Bambi. They would move forward with the CIAA to create cartoons set in Latin American countries. But they would also become part of the overall training efforts of the U.S. military. Following Pearl Harbor, the fear in Los Angeles was palpable. After President Roosevelt declared war on Japan, many on the West Coast were convinced Japanese aggression would continue to major cities and military bases on the West Coast. Neighborhoods created watch groups to monitor the skies for enemy aircraft. City residents were required to keep fabric on hand to cover windows, making inhabited buildings more difficult to spot from the air. For the first half of the week, America was only at war with Japan, but then on Thursday, December 11th, Germany declared war on the U.S., pulling America into the full European conflict. If there was any silver lining to the early days of the war, it was this. The social factions created by the strike quickly faded into the background as senior and junior artists focused on the war. The crowded workrooms for some artists reminded them of happier times at the old Hyperion lot. Along with all of these quick changes, such as passing through a military checkpoint to enter the studio lot and finding military vehicles and guns stationed around their work buildings, the Blairs, like most studio couples, had one additional problem. At this time, the draft included men aged 21 to 35. Lee was then 30 years old, right in the center of the draft range. Like most Disney artists, he was initially unsure what he should do. Some Disney artists signed up for military service almost immediately, but others considered their options over weeks and months, especially as the Disney studio would likely be able to exempt some artists from the draft if they were viewed as essential to the war effort in terms of making training films. For the rest of December, life moved in unusual ways. Disney artists found that some rooms at the studio had been converted into military billets, complete with beds, and other rooms, those where training films were being planned, were off limits to artists without proper security clearance. Camouflage nets covered buildings. The studio nurse encouraged employees to review first aid training. The entire lot practiced blackouts to lower their visibility from the air. The studio appointed wardens to manage evacuation plans, with one warden located in each division and in the animation building on each floor. Upon hearing the emergency signal, "Walk, do not run to the place designated for your safety," Walt told studio employees. The Blairs' peaceful home atop a foothill now seemed disconnected from the world around them. Throughout town, the Blairs regularly saw military vehicles and soldiers moving along the streets. The front page of every paper focused on the war. Residents in their neighborhood laid out plans in case there was an attack from the air. But beyond this, some elements of their pre-war life continued, at least for a little while, such as gallery and community exhibits that had been planned before the attack. Some exhibits quickly tied themselves to the war effort, claiming, "The growth of art is the freedom for which we are fighting." Yet other events, somewhat absurdly, moved forward as they would have the previous year. In December, Lee and Mary both contributed to a showing for the Foundation of Western Art in Los Angeles. Mary's painting was from the South American trip, a scene glimpsed from an airplane of people below preparing the ground for crops. The work was called Communal Plowing Bolivia. A local paper described Lee's work as colorful, but then described Mary's as the life of the party who offered a gay painting. Yet the act of showing general artwork now seemed part of the pre-war world rather than the one in which they lived. At the studio on Christmas Eve, many of the women in the ink and paint department put on a party for the anti-aircraft soldiers stationed there. During these same hours, Lee and Mary drove up the coast to spend the holidays with the Blair family. Since their marriage, Mary's family home just outside San Jose had become the place where they mostly spent the holidays. Mary's father and mother, as well as her two sisters, were warm and inviting. That Christmas, the group exchanged small gifts and talked about what lay ahead with the war, the draft, and the future of the studio. That spring, the world around them continued to change. Anxiety about that imminent air attack decreased, but large questions rested like heavy clouds above them. Another wave of Disney artists signed on for military service, while others still hoped that their work with the Navy training films would qualify them for an exemption. Those who stayed at the studio were required to bring birth certificates to work in order to receive ID badges, which would soon be required to enter the studio lot, as some buildings contained national security secrets. Those who worked on classified training films were also required to review a list of laws pertaining to the protection of national secrets, as well as legal penalties for discussing them outside of work. Mary and Lee continued with their projects, which were focused on general commercial films and shorts supported by the CIAA. As the Latin American cartoons moved through animation, Walt made the decision, in consultation with the CIAA, to release the first 4 as a short feature with a working title of Saludos, though eventually it would be Saludos Amigos in the States. These cartoons featured Donald in Lake Titicaca, partially overseen by Mary, Pedro, the juvenile mail plane, Jose Carioca, the parrot, introducing Donald to the culture and music of Brazil, partially developed by Lee, and Goofy in a standard how-to offering where he is given directions on how to become an Argentine gaucho. To unify these cartoons into a short feature, Disney structured the release as a travelogue about artists visiting South America, where viewers would see regions of each country before watching the cartoon set there. To create a continuous travelogue narrative, Disney included sections of the 16mm film that artists had taken while traveling, including footage shot by Lee. But the footage lacked key scenes to tell the story of their travels. As the previous year, no one had imagined that the 16mm material would be part of a commercial feature. To fill in the gaps, Disney staged additional shots around the studio. Shots of Walt speaking, shots of artists talking together, and shots of individual artists creating drawings. Most of these were over-the-shoulder shots, featuring the artist's hands creating an image with colored pencils or pastels. Mary's hands are easy to spot in the film, as she's the only one with red fingernail polish. In one section, she recreates her image of the Peruvian boy with the flute, only here she uses pastels instead of watercolors. The team also needed to recreate shots of Disney artists boarding a plane and working during the flight itself. To do this, Disney arranged time at the Burbank airport, where a camera operator shot footage of Disney artists climbing into the silver body of an American Airlines DC-3. All of the artists pretending that they were the people they had been the previous year before the war. The new footage would be edited in with material taken by Lee and others on the trip to create a visual story of their journey alongside the finished cartoons partially inspired by their adventures. The decision of what to do now that America was at war rested heavily with the Blairs for much of the spring. A large part of the studio was now focused on military training films, with topics including aircraft riveting, ice formations on the wings of planes, and multiple films to teach new recruits to visually distinguish the planes of allies from those of Axis powers. During these months, the Blairs made small trips to pull themselves away from the problems in L.A., including a weekend visit to Palm Springs in the middle of May. When they returned home, Lee spoke to the Women's Club of South Pasadena on the art of animation with a focus on Fantasia and the forthcoming feature Bambi. He also informed the audience that roughly 75% of the Disney staff was working on training films for the military. At least for now, the studio was focused on serious topics, not just enjoyable animated features for the family. In June, at the age of 61, Lee's father, William, died. He was buried at Forest Lawn Cemeteries. Later in life, Lee rarely talked about his father outside of childhood memories, but his passing may have had an influence on how he viewed his life moving forward. With his father's death, Lee lost some connection to the famous Blairs of earlier eras, those who had worked on the Supreme Court and with American presidents. Lee was still and would always be tethered to the idea of finding success through art or an art-related field, but his father's death may have been enough to free Lee's mind to look in slightly different directions for his future identity, pivoting away from the world of the fine arts. Anyone at the studio could now see that Mary was a rising star, someone with a unique style who could successfully adapt her efforts to fit Walt's vision, while Lee was more of the old and now fading guard, an artist who was trying to adapt Walt's animation to fit an academic understanding of fine art. Perhaps Lee sensed even then that he would only find frustration at a studio where soon he would be playing second fiddle to his wife, and maybe that, along with a general belief that he should contribute to the war, was enough to move him in a new direction. At the time, recruiters were looking for those with experience in film production to work in newly formed film bureaus that, once they were up and operating, would create training films similar to those presently being produced by the Disney studio. During the same week that his father was buried, Lee, along with Mary, hosted a going-away cocktail party for Jack Miller, a member of the Blair Party in South America, as he was joining the Navy as a chief petty officer. By this point, Lee, too, was actively exploring his military options. On July 15th, he underwent an examination for the Army, though he did not sign with them. Instead, he explored other jobs with the military, including with the Navy Bureau that was preparing to make training films. If he chose this path, he would not only contribute to the war effort, but by enlisting in a stateside department, he would avoid being drafted and likely being stationed overseas. On August 24th in Rio, Disney premiered Saludos Amigos, which for the Brazilian market was called Alô Amigos. It debuted simultaneously in 5 theaters around Rio to tremendous public acclaim. None of the Disney artists were in Brazil for the premiere. They learned about its reception through the studio. 3 days after the premiere, Lee resigned from his job at Disney and signed up for the Navy, where he would work on training films for the Navy's Aeronautical Division. At minimum, enlisting in a film unit would keep him stateside and out of combat. His official start date would be November 12, 1942. He would be seen as a manager of sorts, as he had experience at the Disney studio, which had also produced aeronautical films for the Navy. In the weeks before leaving for basic training, Lee, along with Mary, contributed to a variety of community projects, including a 126-foot mural inside of a serviceman's canteen in Hollywood. Sponsored by Hollywood elites, including Bette Davis and John Garfield, the canteen was a large room like a high school gymnasium with a stage, suitable for bands, dancing, and performance, also with small tables to hold drinks. The mural, overseen by Disney artist Elmer Plummer and called Cowboy Heaven, depicted things cowboys dream of. It featured sheriffs, desperados, and can-can girls, all arranged as cartoon caricatures, the type of lightly humorous images that should take the thoughts of soldiers away from the war. The small group of Disney artists who created the mural were largely Mary's friends, including Mark Davis and Retta Scott. Beyond the mural, Lee created patriotic posters to support the war effort. One of his paintings, called They Shall Not Pass, won first place in the Spirit of 42 poster contest. During the second week of November, Lee left Los Angeles and flew to Arizona, ready to report on the 12th for basic training. Lee Blair today arriving in Tucson, Arizona, one local newspaper reported, to take up an indoctrination course at the University of Arizona as a lieutenant junior grade in the U.S. Navy. Following the course, Lieutenant Blair will travel to Washington, D.C. to be affiliated with the Naval Training Film Unit of the Bureau of Aeronautics. Once in D.C., Lee would oversee film production more as a producer than as a concept artist or colorist. This would be his first multi-year break from California and all the things it represented for him: studio animation, art school, and the remnants of the California scene movement. It was also his first extended journey away from family, including from his brother, and whatever subtle family pressure had been placed on him to find artistic success to solidify his identity as a member of the larger Blair family. Though Mary would repeatedly visit Lee while he was in the service, his enlistment also offered a type of break for her as well. For years, Lee's perspective on watercolors had been that of art schools and of the gallery scene. There is nothing to suggest that at this time, Lee was ever unsupportive of Mary's art, but his voice and views were that of artistic conservatism. Without his voice in the house, Mary, almost surely, found more freedom to continue her artistic transformation, with recent changes now taking deeper root. She was free to spend more time at the studio working on special projects and to socialize with friends she had made there, particularly Retta Scott and studio nurse Hazel George. She was also free to find a closer working relationship with Walt Disney without worrying if her growing influence inside the studio placed her husband in an unflattering light. In this, all of the elements were in place now to elevate Mary into a larger role at the studio, into a person who would soon hold a great deal of control over how Disney films were designed and created. I'll be back next week with a new episode. The plan right now, as it will be the first week of February, is to have our news and analysis episode, and there has been a lot going on in the past couple of weeks to talk about. Lastly, as you know, we're an ad-free, listener-supported podcast. We do just two things: deep dives on stories related to the history of the Disney studio and the parks, and news and analysis of current events as they relate to the Disney Company. We are funded entirely by listener contributions, specifically by listeners who join us over on Bandcamp as monthly subscribers. On Bandcamp, you will find over 300 episodes not available on iTunes or anywhere else. But the best reason to join us there is to support the work we do here and to make sure that this podcast continues to exist. You can support us by becoming a monthly subscriber at dhipodcast.bandcamp.com. I'll also leave a link down in our show notes. So, until next Sunday, this is Todd James Pierce.